Yo, what is up guys, Delboy here, aka Blue Collar Sports TV. Hopefully you guys are doing well. If you're new here, smash that like, hit subscribe, all of that good stuff. So this video is a quick preview and prediction for a pretty good fight between Mr. Gary Russell Jr. and Mark Magnifico Magsayo. This fight of course is for the WBC featherweight title, Gary Russell being the defending champion and Mark Magsayo being the challenger. And yeah, all in all, this is a pretty interesting fight. Mark Magsayo is a come-forward fighter with real power. He's always going to try to make it a bit of a war. And Gary Russell Jr. for me is one of the most frustrating fighters in boxing. I mean, he has all of the attributes. Blaring hand speed, good boxing ability, amateur pedigree. You know, I mean, the guy's got a lot of ability, a lot of talent, but he's never really been all that active, and he's never really had the career-defining fights that he's been searching for. And, you know, I always enjoy watching him fight, but the reality is he doesn't fight regularly enough, and when he does fight, it's not always against an intriguing opponent. But I do like this fight, so I'm looking forward to it. Now, let's ever so briefly break down the tale of the tape. Gary Russell Jr. has a record of 31 wins, 1 defeat, 0 draws, 18 of his 31 wins coming by way of knockout. Mark Magsayo has a perfect record of 23-0, 16 of his 23 wins coming by way of knockout. Gary Russell Jr. is listed as 5'4.5", with a 64-inch reach, whereas Mark Magsayo is listed as 5'6", with a 68-inch reach. So in the context of the featherweight division, Magsayo is a much bigger guy. He's got a 4-inch reach advantage and also a 1.5-inch height advantage, and on top of that, he also enters the ring a heavier guy. And ultimately, to stand a chance of winning this fight, Magsayo needs to utilise that size advantage going into this one. Gary Russell Jr. is a southpaw, whereas Mark Magsayo is orthodox, so Gary Russell does have the southpaw advantage. And interestingly, Mark Magsayo not so long ago really struggled with Rigoberto Hermosillo, who is a southpaw himself. Gary Russell Jr. is 33 years old, whereas Mark Magsayo is 26 years old. So yeah, Magsayo does have the youth advantage in this fight, but honestly, I don't really believe it's going to be much of a factor. It's not like Gary Russell is an old 33, where he's taken boatloads of punishment. That's not really been his career. He's not really taken all that much, so I'm assuming that Gary is still going to be very fresh in this fight. And on top of that, Gary does have a lot more experience going into this fight. So honestly, I think Gary Russell's superior experience is more valuable than Mark Magsayo's youth advantage going into this fight. But anyway, now the tale of the tape is out of the way, let's briefly break down what I believe each guy should do, and at the end of this video I will make my prediction. I guess we'll start with the underdog, Mark Magsayo. Now in this fight, he is up against it. Russell is quite a big favourite, but like I said earlier, it's up to Mark Magsayo to really put it on Gary Russell Jr. and make the most of his size advantage. Naturally, Mark Magsayo is a pressure fighter. He really likes to trade with those hooks, both left hook and right hook, hooks to the head, hooks to the body, and he's got a pretty nifty overhand right, like a chopping overhand right as well. That's primarily his arsenal, but one thing for me anyway, that Mark Magsayo doesn't do enough when he's pressuring is stay active with that jab. He tends to follow guys around in straight lines, etc. And against a guy who's fleet-footed like Gary Russell with very quick hands, you could see a scenario where he's getting picked off by 2 or 3 punch combinations, and then Gary Russell spins out and makes Mark Magsayo reset. I think that jab while coming forwards is going to be very important for Mark Magsayo to manoeuvre Gary Russell around that ring and apply constant pressure. Again, he's got a 4-inch reach advantage, so a good stiff long jab while applying pressure, for me, would be beneficial for Mark Magsayo. I mean, some people think that pressuring, the only way you can pressure a guy is to get on his chest and just work, work, work. But you can pressure a guy from the outside behind a nice long jab, and that's what I would advise Mark Magsayo to do. Try not to lunge in with those hooks or the overhand right. Try to pressure Gary Russell behind that jab, and when you have Gary stationary in the corner on the ropes, that's when Mark Magsayo really needs to go all in. Every single time he's got Gary Russell stationary, he needs to close that gap and really work him over. Hooks to the body, hooks to the head, the overhand right down the middle. And yeah, he really needs to take advantage of those moments. If you go back and watch the Jojo Diaz fight and the Tugshot Niambia fight, in those fights there were moments when Gary was a bit stationary, and you know, Niambia and Jojo Diaz had success, particularly to the body in Jojo Diaz's case. I would say that Mark Magsayo, pound for pound, is a bigger puncher than Jojo, so working that body of Gary will be paramount as well to slow those legs down and make him a bit more stationary. And then as the fight does go on, as it drifts into the second part, that's when Mark Magsayo can maybe afford to take more risks, try to actually initiate exchanges in the centre of the ring. I think if Mark Magsayo tries to do that too early, he could walk onto quite a few shots and sustain punishment, therefore nullifying his pressure or making it less effective in the second half of the fight. And when it comes to that jab, you know, he needs to vary it. Gary Russell is a very quick-handed counter-puncher when he wants to be. So, you know, that jab can't be one-paced from Magsayo as he's coming forwards. You want to see Magsayo change the speed of that jab, change the power of the jab, maybe feint a few jabs here and there, vary the jab from body to head, and who knows, maybe even try to draw the lead of Gary Russell off that feint. You know, feint the jab, try to make Gary Russell commit, and then come over the top with that overhand right kind of thing. That sort of thing, you know. We all know how Magsayo is going to fight. He's going to apply pressure, but he needs to add more subtleties to his game, in my opinion, to get to Gary. And on top of that, I want to see Magsayo, and again, this is important in my opinion, he needs a much better defense in this fight. Magsayo has a habit of walking in with his hands down or his guard quite low, and he gets picked off. We saw that against Julio Ceja in his last fight. So a nice tight guard from Magsayo wouldn't go amiss. He's the taller guy. Magsayo's not really a guy who likes to move his head, so I would suggest just a nice tight guard, try to keep tucked in to avoid those body shots, and just apply pressure behind that guard, behind that jab, and try to break down Gary Russell Jr. I mean, the key to victory for Mark Magsayo is not exactly hard. It's to inflict pain, is to slow Gary down and get the knockout, or at least score a couple of knockdowns and win a few more rounds to win a decision. I think winning a decision for Mark Magsayo will be hard, to be honest, but yeah, that's what he needs to do in this fight. It's quite straightforward. As for Gary Russell Jr., I mean, he's got the boxing ability, he's got the athleticism, he's got the combination punching, he's got the boxing acumen to really have a lot of success against a guy like Mark Magsayo, who defensively is vulnerable and who is quite predictable at times when it comes to applying his pressure. And the worst thing for Gary in this sort of fight is that he's having all of his success landing at will, and he gets too greedy. I think in this fight it's paramount for Gary Russell to stay disciplined, try not to hold his feet for too long, get in, 2-3 punch combination, get back out, make Mark Magsayo reset. I'd approach the start of a fight relatively cautiously. If I was Gary Russell, I'd be point scoring, I'd be looking for my openings to land those little combinations and get back out. And you know, if Gary can do that early on and build a lead on the scorecards, at that point I would imagine that Mark Magsayo would start to get more desperate to land that knockout shot. And, you know, I've seen in several Magsayo fights, he's the type of guy who really does sometimes throw out of range, in particular with his overhand right. He'll really kind of lean into it. He'll throw the overhand right, and his body basically follows him, so his head goes way beyond his front foot, and that's the perfect opportunity for Gary to land either his own left hand out of that southpaw stance for straight left, or even his uppercut. Mark Magsayo, he does take risks, there's no doubt about it, and Gary needs to be conscious of that and take those opportunities and walk him into big shots, because Gary's not a huge puncher, but he's a hurtful puncher, if that makes sense. You feel what he's doing to you. You're not really going to walk through Gary like he's nothing. Even Jojo Diaz, who was a big featherweight, he couldn't just walk down Gary and have his own way. So, Gary needs to be looking for those opportunities to put Mark Magsayo back in his place, land a snapping hard counter, and cause a bit of damage, And ultimately, Gary, I think he needs to fight this fight, again, pretty cautiously, but again, he can't be too cautious where Mark Magsayo is just walking him down. Even if Magsayo is not landing much, it can create a bad impression for judges, and you're not going to discourage your opponent. You might frustrate him, but you're not really going to discourage him in regards to walking into something. So yeah, Gary needs to be careful, but he also needs to be conscious of the fact that he needs to try and slow this guy down and stop him in his tracks. Fighting a guy who's taller and who has a longer reach, who's going to apply pressure, I think head movement for Gary Russell in this fight is going to be important. I know he's small, but he needs to be a small target in this fight. Maybe fight out of that crouch, fire that jab upwards through the guard of Mark Magsayo and make the guy reset. Gary Russell, he's got all of the ability in the world. He's got all of the athleticism in the world. I think if he were to lose this fight, essentially it would be one of two things. Either he's slowed down enough for Mark Magsayo to catch him, or he just gets careless and gets caught, because he's clearly the better boxer. He's got quicker feet, quicker hands, better combination punching, more experience, better amateur background. I think this is one of those fights where Gary Russell can make it as easy or as hard as he wants. So yeah, to me this is Gary Russell's fight to lose. But, given the power, given the size of Mark Magsayo, he is definitely dangerous. So it's an interesting fight in my opinion. But yeah, in regards to my actual prediction, I am going with Gary Russell Jr. I think that's the safe bet in this fight. And I would say the safe bet is on points, but a stoppage is possible. Mark Magsayo has been hurt before, and I think Gary has enough power, enough speed to definitely get Magsayo's attention, maybe even hurt him, drop him, and eventually overwhelm him. So I think a late stoppage is possible, but for me the safe bet would more than likely be Gary Russell Jr. on points. But it's a good fight, and like I said, Magsayo does carry knockout power, so he will be dangerous. What about you guys though? Who are you picking to win this fight? I see most people like me going for Gary Russell, but what about you guys? Share your thoughts below. It's been your guy Delboy. Peace.